The swamp gripped my boots and did not return them clean. Mosquitoes tuned the air to a single cruel note. I lowered the canteen, shook it, heard failure rattle. We had walked a day on the Burma track and sweated our rations onto the ground. The water all around us gleamed like a rumor. It smelled of rot and bright leaves and the patient breath of things that never learned to hurry. Sunlight dappled a sheen over black pools where roots made cages. A heron lifted, slow as prayer. My tongue felt like cloth. A map creased my pocket, but maps can't drink. The river was off to the west, swollen with rain and fever stories. Boiling meant smoke and time. Time meant attention. Attention in the monsoon meant questions with tooth marks. Tablets turned swamp to pool in theory, but our last halazone tin rattled like a dice cup with one. The sergeant folded the silence between us like a tarp. We listened to the ground as if it might. I knelt and scooped a handful. It slid through my fingers as if considering me. The surface shivered when a drop landed, the way a horse shivers at a fly. We had the steel of helmets, the canvas of packs, the patience of men who have learned that the jungle respects no argument but the right one. Everything else the ground will keep. A dragonfly found my shadow and stitched it to the water, briefly, then let it go. The sun reached down with a hot hand. Somewhere a mortar tried on a thought far away. We were small, we were thirsty. The ground breathed. The ground held its counsel. The ground, stubborn and quiet, waited for us to remember. Thirst narrows the world to a mouth. The swamp widened it to include every doubt I had. Leeches threaded the water like punctuation. A slick film broke under fingertips and sealed again, smug. The unseen enemy was not the enemy on the map. It was what lived in that green gloss. Parasites, rot, the small arsenals of fever, and the rule that we could not light a clean blue boil for proof. The jungle hunted by patience. We were prey with watches. We had watched men drink early on and pay later. Fever walks softly at first, all velvet apology, then takes your legs away from you. Dysentery has its own calendar. The medics carried tablets that bullied water into something drinkable when they felt like it, but supply lines lie in rain. One canteen each, one mouth to argue with the day. The swamp smiled in wide vowels. I pinched a drop on a fingertip and smelled leaf tar and egg. The sergeant's jaw was a locked drawer. We both knew the arithmetic. No water meant slower feet. Slower feet meant longer in range. Everything else cascaded from that. The swamp did not care if our cause had a hymn or a flag. It cared about bodies. The mosquitoes picked targets by breath. We tried to breathe like stones. The ground under the roots felt spongy, the top inch slick, the layers below firm as old bread. A minute breeze crumpled the water and unfolded it again. Somewhere in that gesture lived an answer. The enemy here was invisibility, the kind that sits in a cup and smiles like a friend. Our throats made promises our heads could not honor. We didn't need courage. We needed a way to make the ground work for us. Burma, monsoon season, a year when maps bled and dates felt theoretical. We were a reconnaissance section feeling for a road rumor placed between two villages with names we mangled. The Chindwin lay swollen and brown off our flank, the air a warm towel you couldn't drop. Our packs were lighter than orders liked. Lister bags dangled at battalion when battalion existed. Out here, chemistry lived in tins. Water discipline is a religion that only thirst truly preaches. Boiling takes time, fuel, and a permission slip from the sky. Halazone turns bad water into something technically obedient and morally unkind. The swamp gave us plenty and nothing in the same cup. We had no interest in heroics. We wanted transportable mornings. The stakes were not medals. They were the difference between seeing tomorrow's ridge or lying down here for a long, feverish talk with insects. Men are not dramatic when dehydrated. They become arithmetic done badly. Our sergeant believed in ground the way some men believe in luck. A bank can filter a river. A hillside can sweeten a spring. A mile of earth can turn flood into town water you trust. The words came like a page torn from a book. Bank filtration. We were soldiers, not engineers, but we knew this. The world hides its cleanest water just beside its dirtiest. A river's edge will drink and give back. A swamp will too if you ask in the old language, quietly, with a spade. The helmet became a bowl again. The entrenching tool unfolded like a sentence. We moved a few careful paces back from the pool's lip and pressed steel into ground that still remembered being dry. The jungle watched. The sky pretended indifference. We dug toward an invisible well, patient. The first hole filled like a confession. We'd gone too close to the pool. Brown water slipped in fast, thick with silt that settled only to rise again when a root exhaled. We scooped, waited, watched it cloud at a fingertip's touch. Patience is a discipline that thirst hates. We backed off 2 more paces and dug again, this time deeper, this time narrower, our boots finding a firmer grammar under the mud's slang. The shovel bit into sand that rasped like dry sugar. The top layer bled tea, below the color gentled. We lined the sides with a sleeve cut from a sandbag so the walls would not slough and betray us back to soup. The helmet became a bailer. The hole made its demand, time. We skimmed, let it seep, skimmed again. The jungle whispered its indifference through leaves the size of magazines. A dragonfly returned to practice needlework on light. The hole cleared and then lied, a ghost of cloud rising if our shadow moved. We learned to walk softly around our own work. A second hole joined the first, offset like lungs. One was for settling, the other for drawing. Between them, the ground did the arithmetic, the tablets performed with bitterness. The water began to look like an argument won with courtesy. A canvas scrap stretched over the drawing hole kept insects away. A length of cloth from a shirt became a pre-filter we rinsed and replaced, lay across the mouth like a veil. The surface went still enough that sky could see itself without flinching. We filled a mess tin and watched, waiting for betrayal. It did not. The swamp was at arm's length, still huge, still dangerous, suddenly negotiable. We listened to the ground finish our sentence. The first swallow tasted of almost, clearer than the pool, kinder than the tablet, but with a ghost of swamp that spoke in vowels you couldn't ignore. Good, not good enough. The sergeant set his helmet in the sand and began to build a small hill inside it with a mason's care. Coarse at the bottom, finer above, then a felt of cloth we could spare. From a ration tin he tipped out a paper twist he'd been carrying since the last time smoke was allowed, a pocket of cold charcoal he'd raked and saved. It broke under thumb, soft as chalk. Layer by layer, the helmet became a column. At the mouth, a circle of cloth, rinsed and wrung, stretched tight as a drum. At the base, a few pebbles to keep the drain honest. He set the helmet on a ring of twigs to lift it from the wet and angled a mess tin underneath like a believer at a font basin. Then he dipped his cup into the settling hole and poured slow. Water learned manners in that descent. It hesitated at the cloth, threaded the charcoal's dark forest, slowed in the fine sand, and left the coarse grains with what it no longer wanted to carry. The first trickle into the tin was shy, almost not there, a thread of light more than liquid. We waited. The second trickle found courage. By the third, the mess tin began to think of full. The jungle smelled of green knives. Our little church smelled of nothing. I touched a finger to the stream and tasted absence. We were making ground into a filter and silence into a blessing. The swamp watched and could not object. We had asked correctly. We settled into a ritual that felt older than our uniforms. First, the earthwork. 2 seep holes, one for settling, one for drawing, both skirted with cloth collars to keep banks from crumbling into our patience. Then the helmet, nested with stone, sand, finer sand, a charcoal veil, and a tight lid of fabric. We anchored it on a ring so the mud couldn't bribe away the heat of the day stored in metal. We poured from the settling pool with the grace of men paying respect. The first pint we set aside for the man with the radio, because air weighs more when your mouth is dry. The second went to tea, brewed low in a mess tin that kept its steam quiet. The third filled canteens one hand at a time, the charcoal steadying taste, the sand removing drama, the cloth stopping the jungle's smallest engineers from hitching a ride. When we had tablets, we fed one to each canteen. When we did not, the ground's long thinking had to be enough. We learned the timings. Let the seep rest, punish haste, clean the cloth, change the sand when it began to remember too well. The helmet became a tool we wiped as reverently as a rifle. The water trembled against light and did not flinch. It tasted like nothing, which is the highest compliment a throat can give. No stomachs complained, no fever introduced itself with polite coughs. That night we wrote in a damp diary, bank well, helmet filter, patience. The page puckered and held the words like a palm. Frogs threw their voices between trees. The ground offered a cool breath from the holes as if proud. Every system needs a witness. Ours needed none, but it had one. The trick traveled the way fieldcraft travels, by rumor that feeds itself with proof. In New Guinea, sappers dug shore wells along Naipa banks and drank river without river's bite. In Italy, a mule train crew lined ammo tins with gravel and sand, set them in culverts, and let seepage preach while shells spoke overhead. On islands where coral held rain like a cup, Marines scooped pits back from brackish ponds and drew something that tasted like the sky before it became a story. Engineers wrote it down with pens. Infiltration gallery, bank well, slow sand. Medics added a line about tablets for insurance and moved on. Refugee camps at map edges dug shallow wells beside foul canals and watched them clear. A woman in a bombed city set a colander atop a bowl, layered pebbles, sand, and charcoal from a neighbor's stove, and caught drips that made soup kinder to the child on her hip. Bank filtration became a city's quiet worker in places with rivers that carried error. 1,000 tons of sand did what our helmet had done, made clean at the speed of patience, then asked a touch of chlorine like a signature. The principle stayed small enough for a rucksack and big enough to supply a town. You could chalk it on a wall, let the ground do it first. Word reached us months later from a unit we'd never see. Their note was 2 sentences, written on waxed paper that had wrapped biscuits. Tried your seep. Works. The swamp kept the rest of the message, as it keeps most things. The ground had learned our names and then, as usual, forgotten them. That is its courtesy. Water carries stories, clay, rot, tiny mouths that want to live in you. Earth edits. When you carve a well just back from a swamp or river, you ask the bank to read the water first. Between pool and hole, liquid crosses a piece of world that grabs what doesn't belong. Sand and silt strain, yes, but more important, they host a living skin, the slim biofilm that eats what would have eaten you. Time is its air. Depth is its grammar. The result is not a miracle. It is patience doing arithmetic with pores. Our helmet filter repeated the same sentence in fewer words. Pebbles spread flow. Coarse sand slowed it. Fine sand made it, linger long enough to drop what was heavy, and let the small kingdom on each grain do its work. Charcoal added the quiet trick of adsorption, holding tastes and odors the way a library holds whispers. Cloth stopped legs and wings. No stage for smoke, no invitation to attention, only the modest applause of water. Nothing here pardons everything. Viruses laugh at pride. Some beasts slip through seams. Clear is not the same as safe. The medic's tablets were our signature when we had them. A small chlorine letter on a page the ground had written well. Boiling, when allowed, was still the priest with the final word. But the old earth did most of the sermon, and it did it silently. There is a philosophy in that. Ask the ground first, begin low, spread the force. Give time a corridor and it will carry weight you cannot lift loudly. War teaches loud answers, and then the world teaches the rest. The swamp had not changed. We had changed our question. The ground, flint and generous, answered. Years after the war, a storm walked through the city and unscrewed the lights. Faucets coughed dust. People lined buckets in halls, eyes on phones as if signal could become rain. I went to the yard and dug 2 shallow holes beside the brown ditch that pretended to be creek. The old motions returned with the ease of a scar. Sand from a bag, pebbles from the flower bed, charcoal from a grill swept and sifted. The helmet had retired. A kitchen colander wore the work instead. Neighbors watched with the skepticism modern life trains into us. Clear water trickled into a pot like a modest confession. I boiled the first batch on a camping stove, then trusted the old method. The rest I let the ground finish, then touched a strip that once lived in a pool kit to satisfy an American itch. The numbers smiled back. The taste smiled. Silence learned a new address, and the yard held breath. I keep a filter at home that boasts about microns and absolute ratings. It is excellent. It is not offended by the old trick. Sometimes I pour creek seep through the cartridge and watch it do nothing because there is nothing left to do. The ground had signed the work. In camps raised after storms, I have seen buckets stacked into columns with sand, charcoal, cloth. In towns by troubled rivers, bank wells feed plants that hum with a confidence our helmets never had. Old and new shake hands. When I teach scouts, we begin at the water's edge and then step back. The urge to dip and drink is strong. The faith to wait is stronger. The ground still knows the hymn. You only have to hum along. Some nights the rain returns in the roof's thin drum, and I am back on the Burma track tasting metal and leaf. The swamp opens like a dark book, and we are small writing trying not to smear. I see the helmet, the sand, the careful holes that filled with patience instead of noise. I remember the first sweet blankness on the tongue, an absence of taste like a door unlocking in the chest. The ground had worked, had not bragged. We live in an age that adores instant proofs. Water, like courage, resists hurry. The old method is not romance. It is geometry and biology, shoveled into place with humility. Step back from the pool. Let the bank do the first reading. Slow the flow through grains that prefer work to spectacle. Add a charcoal whisper to take ghosts away. If you can, bless it with a tablet or a boil first. If you cannot, trust the oldest editor on earth and then move with care. I keep a small jar of clean sand on a shelf near the stove. Not a trophy. It is a reminder that the world is full of silent tools that wait for correct questions. The jar says what the sergeant never explained. Begin with ground, finish with light. Pour slowly. Listen. When my children ask for stories, sometimes they want heroes first. Sometimes they want instructions as memory. I tell them about 2 holes, a helmet, and a drink that tasted like nothing. If stories like this remind you what endurance really means, subscribe and keep these lessons alive. The rain loosens its grip. The house settles slow. The jar waits without hurry. We never carried a filter, yet somehow the ground carried us,